I may be losing my mind, but that sounds like frogs.
Hi, welcome back. So picking up from where we left off, having thought a little bit about Greek comedy, let's get stuck into Frogs, what Frogs is about, and where the humour really comes from. Why study frogs at all? So Frogs was first produced at the Dionysia in 405 BC, and it was actually later reproduced at the Lanaia of 404, so a smaller, kind of more local festival. Frogs really focuses on Dionysus, the god of theatre, and it's quite unusual for us to think about putting a god on stage. It's something that the Greeks were really comfortable with, and remember, in context, the theatre festival is the Dionysia. All of these different genres of performance came out of dithyramb, so a form of praise for the god. In Frogs, Dionysus takes centre stage with his slave Xanthias.
We have wasted enough time. That frog was an omen. We must start our journey. We are off on a great mission.
Where?
I can't tell you.
We don't talk the way we used to.
But I can tell you, it's of the utmost importance to the world. It's crucial to the survival of mankind.
As long as there's no pressure. Could you give me a hint?
Oh, very well. I, Dionysus, god of drama, am going to travel to the underworld and bring back a great writer who can speak to the problems of our society and give us comfort, wit, and wisdom, and also challenge our complacencies. We have been starved of food for thought. The Peloponnesian War still rages on, Xanthias. A war we may not be able to win. A war we shouldn't even be in. People are frightened and running out of hope. A great artist could be our salvation.
But what about our leaders?
Have you listened to our leaders? Words seem to fail them.
And they decide to go down to the underworld to retrieve Dionysus' favourite tragedian, Euripides. Euripides died in 406, so just about a year before Frogs was produced, and Sophocles had died in 407 BC. Although Sophocles started to write before Euripides, there's a huge overlap between their careers, and they were near contemporaries. And although Sophocles is mentioned in Frogs, when Dionysus and Xanthias reach the underworld, we only meet Euripides and Aeschylus. Euripides has been put on stage elsewhere in Aristophanes' comedies as well, as has the tragic playwright Agathon. So these two figures come up in different plays, and they're sort of effeminate figures, so they come up in Agathon helps with cross-dressing in Women at the Thesmophoria, for example. So these tragedians have a celebrity status and appear as key characters on stage. Sometimes the jokes are about their work, sometimes we might think that they're about the status of these tragedians as celebrities. So at the opening of Frogs, we get Xanthias and Dionysus coming on stage.
I love to travel, don't you? I love a change of pace, I love a change of space, I love to see a place that's absolutely new.
Sweat.
I love to travel, don't you?
Live.
Of course you do.
Rain, fog, gnats, wasps, snakes, mosquitoes.
To travel, I say we leave the world alone, it may unravel, but it's the mess we've always known. Alright, okay, it isn't perfect, still it's perfectly okay, and if it's gonna go to hell, then let it, why should I as well? Forget it, first I have the grit, then trouble with my hip, now I have blisters on my lip, this trip is giving me the pip.
You can stop rhyming right there. Now cheer up, we're on our way to save mankind.
What did they ever do for us?
Look, if you're not moving forward, you're just standing still.
And your point is?
We're traveling.
In the vase painting I'm going to show you now, we can see the idea of a comic slave like Xanthias. He's really bloated, he's got his fat suit on, big gaping mouth, tufty beard, and we can see how all of these elements of the costume could be used for comic effect in the way that, as a double act, they're pretty interesting. So they bumble on stage together, and that immediately puts Dionysus at the level of his slave. They're very much a double act. On stage, Dionysus appears already in a ridiculous disguise. So Dionysus has disguised himself as the hero Hercules, or Heracles, but he's not going to be Heracles as you know him from other versions of the myth. The comic Heracles is really a kind of washed up version of the hero that you might know from, say, epic or other poetry. He's quite fat, he's quite greedy, and he's a bit of a meathead. He kind of bumbles around with his club in his lion skin. He's a little bit like when you see footballers go to pot after their careers have ended, and he becomes this caricature of a kind of blokey figure. So Dionysus, beautified and not blokey as he is wearing this ridiculous costume, and it looks completely out of place on him. So when Xanthias and Dionysus bumble onto stage, they do something that we as a modern audience might not be prepared for, but something that an Athenian audience might be expecting. And that's actually making reference to the comedy as a comedy. Really often in Greek comedy, we get these self-aware moments, we get mentions of what an audience might find funny. And so Xanthias comes out, and the first thing he says is, "Shall I make the usual cracks, master, that the audience always laugh at?" So comedy is really self-aware, and it's not just critiquing tragedy and the tragedians in Frogs through going to meet them in the underworld, it's critiquing comedy at the same time. Shall I roll out the normal jokes that everybody is expecting? And you can see that Dionysus is trying to advise Xanthias, and we would expect him to from his kind of elevated position, not just as the master, but as the god for whom all drama is created. But notice Dionysus can only tell him what not to do. He can't make a helpful suggestion. Xanthias as well has come out in a similarly funny get-up, so he is lugging lots and lots of crap, really, lots of baggage on his back. And so he's kind of stumbling in after Dionysus, who's presumably danced ahead of him. So despite the equality in their dialogue at the beginning, we might actually say as well on stage, it's much clearer that there's a power discrepancy between the two, and that's going to be flipped in future scenes in the comedy as well, so that's something to look out for. So what we get from the off in Aristophanes' Frogs is Dionysus coming out as a comic actor. He's stage managing Xanthias, they're talking about the best jokes to make, they're talking directly about the audience, and they've come in, blundering in, with a load of baggage and a ridiculous costume. So, having been told that the title of the play is Frogs, the audience sat and they recognised that Dionysus is kind of coming out in this disguise, probably a very thinly veiled disguise, while Xanthias, the kind of stock slave character, hobbles out with lots of stuff. It's really similar, I think, to the kind of power balance we see between Del Boy and Rodney in Only Fools. If you think about Del Boy being this sort of what can we say, like pseudo-classy bloke, someone who's always trying to look the part, very dapper, bit of a dandy, and then Rodney's kind of lurching round after him, lumbering round after him. In appearance, we might expect that. Another way of thinking about it is looking at the opening of Bottom Live. Whenever you see Bottom Live on stage, there's usually some off-stage dialogue. Everyone in the audience is waiting for Richie and Eddie, the two main characters, the double act in Bottom, who are really known for lots of physical comedy, lots of violence, and some really kind of offbeat, weird banter that doesn't really go anywhere. So the audience are waiting with bated breath, and the big reveal, you can see on the clips the kind of reaction this gets from the audience. One thing I would pay attention to when you're looking at Bottom Live and comparing it to, say, Xanthias' costume is thinking about how a comic actor could act with their whole body. So how movements and gesture would be really, really funny, even at times where the lines aren't always being spoken in rapid fire and rapid succession. It's an unusual comparison because obviously in Bottom Live, Richie and Eddie aren't wearing masks, but if you look at some of the faces that Rick Mail pulls and actually compare them to Greek comic masks, they're really, really similar. Also the way that they amp up the audience. So Bottom Live is based on a story, but there's a lot of ad-libbing and there's a lot of jokes that aren't perhaps written, so some of it is kind of what we might call improv. There may well have been a place for that in ancient comedy, but of course we're relying on text to provide sources, so there's a chance that some of the jokes that are in there have been added by the choregos, the person who would be directing the comedy, or by an actor or something like that. And they might sometimes be a little bit more spontaneous than we'd have really imagined because we're stuck with a written text. So having a look at Bottom Live, comparing it to the vases, will give you a good impression of what these two characters would look like appearing on stage. Another place to have a look would be to look at the production of Frogs put on in New York, with a couple of really famous actors, and you can see how that was interpreted as musical comedy, as musical theatre, but very much in a Greek style. Okay, so I hope that's helped you understand the opening of Frogs a little bit more. You can see the dynamic that's coming up between Dionysus and Xanthias. They're trying to amp up the audience. They're trying to negotiate who is the most powerful, who has to carry the materials that Xanthias is dragging along with him. And then there's some jokes about a donkey as well. Very unlikely that a live animal would be on stage, so the kind of absurdity of really poor costumes and equipment could be coming in. And in comedy, remember, there's space for costume and props to be crap. In a way, it's funnier if they are. And again, going back to Bottom, if you think about some of the setup and the sets and some of the costumes that they use in there, they're not always fantastic, and if they were, it would kind of take something away from it. So hopefully these clips have given you a better impression of how the comedy would start off, and when we come back we're going to look at the start of Dionysus' mission to the underworld and his interaction with Heracles. Okay, so I'm hoping you're going to join me for the rest of the videos in the series, and you can see them theme by theme if you want to follow along with Frogs.
Cool.